Hello and welcome to this CIPS Foundation special episode of Futures, the podcast series brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. Hi everyone and welcome to the CIPS Futures podcast. I'm James Moore, part of the CIPS editorial team, and I'm delighted to be joined by my co-host today, Emma Scott, who heads up the CIPS Foundation. How are you, Emma?
Oh, good, thanks. It's nice to be on the podcast again. How are you doing, James?
Great to have you back on. I'm doing well, thank you. Yeah, it's been a fantastic summer. Lots of CIPS Awards events. We've had futures, conferences, lots of things going on. So it's been great.
I've seen you pop up everywhere, James. So it's really great to see the content still going at it. So it's really nice to see the podcast still continuing as well. So I've been enjoying listening to those too.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I'm learning from the best. But I know you've obviously moved into a kind of new role heading up the CIPS Foundation. Do you want to just give us a little bit of background, but especially for those who might not be aware of the CIPS Foundation, all the fantastic work that it does?
What I've learned is that not many people know about CIPS Foundation, although it's been around for many years, actually. So I've been at CIPS for 19 years and obviously aware of it. And it's ebbed and flowed in terms of its activities. But over the last 12 months, we've really supercharged it, if you like, and we've awarded some projects. So it was originally set up to be an educational fund to provide bursaries for students to help them through their studies, and we still do that. And then I think it was around about 2018, we actually thought, if we invested some money in projects, in charities and organisations, we can make even more impact. So the foundation is really there to improve supply chains from a sustainability perspective, to make them fairer, more sustainable, more equitable. And we invest in projects to make sure that happens.
I've looked at some of the projects that you're working on this year. They're really, really fantastic projects. I know you can find out lots of information about them on the CIPS Foundation Hub, which we'll put a link in on the episode description. So do check it out. But I think it's such a great way for CIPS members to think about how they're contributing as well to kind of wider procurement and supply chain best practices that impact individuals, communities, and also broader societal issues. And on that note, tackling modern slavery is a huge issue that society faces, but procurement and supply chain professionals are often on the front line of. And that leads us neatly onto today's pod, doesn't it, Emma?
It certainly does. So let's get started and invite today's guests. So I'm delighted to be able to be joined by one of our charities we support today. That's Andrew Wallis from Unseen. Welcome, Andrew. And Madeline Fitton, who's a modern slavery expert working for Sodexo. So welcome to you both to the podcast. Thanks for joining us. Andrew, tell us a little bit about you and introduce yourself.
So I'm the founder and CEO of Unseen. Unseen does 6 main things. So we work directly with victims of trafficking identified within the UK. We work with all the major statutory agencies. So that's everything from the National Crime Agency and Border Force down to local police, government, health. We then run the UK's National Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline. We work with businesses, helping them tackle issues of forced labour within their supply chains and how to respond to labour exploitation. And we then carry out policy and research based on all of that sort of frontline work that we do alongside academic institutions. And then finally, we use all of that to work with governments to help them improve legislation and policy and practice.
Great stuff. And Madeline, welcome. Tell us a bit about you and your role.
Thanks, Emma. So, as you said, I am the modern slavery specialist for the UK and I region for Sodexo. Sodexo is a global facilities management company. We employ 33,000 people in the UK, and we do a number of services from hard, soft FM, and catering cleaning. As well as that, I am the founder and chair of the BSA Modern Slavery Council, which is a collaboration between private companies and government and NGOs. And I founded and chair the Ireland Modern Slavery Council as well. And those groups are put together to collaborate, to share information, to create resources to support the tackling modern slavery effort within the UK and Ireland.
Great stuff. Well, welcome. A powerhouse of guests here today. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, Andrew, I was trying to think how long ago it was we first met. It was a very long time ago. And we've been working alongside each other on and off for many, many years. But more recently, the CIPS Foundation awarded Unseen a grant. Can you tell us a little bit about that project and how that grant is helping?
Sure. And it was wonderful to get that grant. The problem we're trying to address and resolve through this grant is how can we improve the speed at which we do data analysis on the helpline so that we can then inform businesses where their risks are within their supply chains. So what we see on the helpline is calls coming in, often from people that are working within the supply chains, particularly within the UK. And we want to be able to funnel that information through in a really timely and accurate manner to those businesses, and then work with those businesses to resolve those problems so that we get to a more ethical procurement process, that we're driving accountability, and we're providing businesses with the tools that they can then act really swiftly and get people out of exploitative situations.
What kind of calls do you get from the helpline? Tell us a little bit about the helpline itself.
So the helpline now is receiving about 1,000 contacts a month through calls, through the Unseen app, and via the web, through our web form. And it's a real mixture of calls. We have calls from people who are victims saying, I'm in this situation, how do I get out of this? Some of them will want to engage with law enforcement and others don't, so we can then signpost them to the appropriate agencies. We get calls from the public saying, I think I've seen something that might be exploitative, and those are really important. Often they're the beginnings of a process that can lead to a modern slavery case. Then we get calls from businesses going, I think I've got a problem somewhere, I've come across something, how do I deal with this? Or from people within those supply chains who are saying, I'm in this situation, I'm in this factory, I'm in this field, I'm in this logistics center, or whatever, and these are the brand names that I see around us. And then we get calls from frontline professionals going, I've got somebody in front of me where it might be in accident emergency, or it could be in policing or fire or health or local government. And I think they might be a victim of trafficking. I don't deal with this normally. Talk me through what I need to do in that whole procedure. So it's a whole gamut. And interestingly, what we're seeing this year, after sort of 2 years of plateau of modern slavery cases, is suddenly modern slavery cases are taking off again. And we're just trying to do the analysis as to what's going on there. You know, is there an increase, or has there been some awareness campaign that has led to sort of more calls? So we would say that the helpline now is the largest data set outside of government data sets that tells us what's going on in terms of modern slavery and also the trends that we're seeing. And we've just published a report into the hospitality sector where we're suddenly seeing exploitation taking off. And previously to that, we published one on the care sector.
Excellent. There's massive amounts of data and insights and trends, like you say. Madeline, how important is this kind of intelligence from the labour abuses to the work that you do? And I guess other procurement professionals must find that incredibly useful.
It's extremely important, Emma. And one of the reasons is because, as Andrew very well knows, this crime morphs all the time. Gangmasters find different ways of manipulating systems, processes, and governance to allow access, as we saw in the care industry with student visas, as we're now seeing in the report on hospitality that Unseen launched in the last week. All of that data you need to keep abreast with. And that includes areas where the GLAA might be reporting as well, CIPS, the ILO, the Global Slavery Index, Supply Chain Sustainability School, everything down to pieces that might be heard in parliamentary evidence sessions. This is where you can get that information and take it and use it. And this is free. So this isn't a budget issue for businesses. These are resources that are out there, freely available to use and to create your risk assessment on your supply chains and develop and refresh that. And as well, your audit programs, focusing where it needs to happen.
So getting that data timely is quite important, isn't it? Like you say, the landscape changes at such pace. So that timeliness of the data is really key as well.
It is. And international supply chains as well as UK, where you've seen spikes, then that's where you need to be focusing your efforts, your audits, and changing your risk assessment for high risk categories.
Madeline, as you've just explained, this is an incredibly complex issue. It's a global issue. It's not an easy one to tackle from a procurement and supply chain professional. How important is it to collaborate with organisations like Unseen on the modern slavery issue?
It's extremely important. And obviously the councils are creating links between NGOs and businesses that were not as aware as they could have been to the work that Unseen do and the kind of information that is available, the resources that are available from charities and NGOs as well. But the absolute requirement here is to manage the identification of a victim in the right way. That is when, for me, the risk is the highest. When a business might identify a person, that can put them in extreme jeopardy and you can hit threat to life situations. That's when you need to manage it correctly in a victim-centred way, and you need to be aware of the people that are around that possible victim and support. So you need a security plan in place. You need to understand how you are going to report it. You need to understand how you talk to that person, because at that point in time, they are probably terrified that they have been identified and the people that are controlling them might find out about that. So this is where Unseen come in and the helpline to support, to help that person to be extracted and then hopefully get the help and support that they need in safeguarding and with agencies and the police.
Andrew, it's been 10 years since we chatted at the launch of the Modern Slavery Act at the Home Office. I remember a launch event there. That was fairly leading edge at the time and quite forward thinking. We know much more now than we did then. What is the legislative landscape now? What's the size of the problem? Have things improved? What's your gauge on that?
Yeah, it has been 10 years and it's gone very quickly, those 10 years. But I think, some significant things have changed, which is actually for most businesses now, they do know what modern slavery is. That understanding, of course, is on a spectrum. And that wouldn't have happened without things like the Modern Slavery Act, and in particular, Section 54, which was transparency in supply chains, which was saying to businesses, tell us what you're doing in order to tackle this problem. I think we've seen a real sophistication grow up, and some of the work that Madeline's doing is testament to that in terms of this is not business as usual for businesses. Finding victims of exploitation within your business or within your supply chains. And it's interesting, the trade strategy that's just come out from the Department of Business and Trade explicitly says work with NGOs on this, because they're the key knowledge holders and they're the experts in dealing with this. So I think the landscape has changed. But however, what we've seen is a kind of lukewarm response from business to Section 54. We still have 7,000 businesses that have never produced a modern slavery statement. And what we've seen around the globe is, yes, the UK took the lead, but we've now seen legislation grow up around the globe. And what it is now moving towards is what we call managed human rights due diligence, which is saying to businesses, you have a responsibility to know where your supply chains go, to know the circumstances in which either workers are being treated or goods are being made or raw materials are being extracted. And it is not enough to say, well, I know where my tier ones go, but I don't know beyond that. So I think there is this movement to say, you must know where your supply chains go and you must know the circumstances around it. So that is called mandatory human rights due diligence. And then we've seen, particularly in the US and the EU now following what's called forced labor bans. And what that means is that if goods are tainted by forced labor, they cannot enter that market space. And the US has developed it even further with what's called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which has a presumptive clause in it, which says we will presume everything that comes out of Xinjiang in China is tainted by forced labor and it cannot have access to the market unless you can prove otherwise. And so what we're seeing is a legislation growing up, and what we're now seeing in the UK, and we saw this with the Select Committee on Business and Trade, headed up by Liam Byrne, and then the Joint Committee on Human Rights, looking into forced labor and supply chains. Both businesses and parliamentarians explicitly saying we want to see a mandatory human rights due diligence and forced labor bans. And the reason for that is the good businesses want to keep doing good business and doing business well, but they want a level playing field. They don't want to be the only ones that have to do it. They want all businesses have to be subject to this. So I think what we will see, if we're still all here in 10 years' time and we were to regroup, I think what we will see is that legislation in place, that requirement on business and on procurement in particular, to know where and how you're procuring and what is actually going on, because it will not be a defense to say, I didn't know anything. It will be a defense to say, yes, we've put all of these processes in place and we've been doing all of this. And thank you very much that you spotted something else over in this part of the supply chain. We know what to do now that we've found it and we're executing that. Then you'll be safe. But a defense of plausible deniability will end up with either significant fines or directed disqualification or PR disaster for a business.
You always describe the act as spiky carrots, did you used to describe it as? And I think it's kind of, I guess it was the carrot enough for people to want to act. And I know one thing that you always talk about is kind of the economics impact, the size of the issue. If you can tell us a little bit about that.
All legislation should be a spiky carrot. There should be incentives to do the right thing, but there should be penalties. And unfortunately, with the Modern Slavery Act, the penalty within Section 54 was never executed by government. But what we have understood in the intervening 10 years is just how big this problem is. So we now talk of modern slavery as an economic crime. If you were to say, if modern slavery was a business, it would be turning over a profit of $500 billion per annum. That dwarfs any business. That makes the tech bros look like little diddly squats. So it is a massive, massive industry. We see about 50 million people in situations of modern slavery. And remember, that is an estimate and that is never the complete number because you can never fully quantify something that's hidden. And of that 50 million, about 28 million are in situations of forced labor, i.e. in the world's supply chains. In the UK, at any one time, we see about 130,000 people held in situations of modern slavery. Again, that's a conservative number. But just to put that into context, and these are Home Office figures, that 130,000 people equates to about 60 billion socioeconomic cost. That's 2% of GDP. And in these really difficult economic times, to have a 2% GDP anchor out the back of UK economy and on UK PLC is really, really significant. So we need to recognize the size of the problem, which actually then leads us to, and then we need to have a proportionate response to that scale of the problem.
That is some figure that you've, some figures, I suppose, that you've quoted there, Andrew, and it really puts it into stark perspective of the challenge here and the size of this issue. Madeline, I'm curious as to your perception of what you think will really make a difference going forward from a business perspective. Is it putting it into that kind of business economic mindset and listening to some of those figures from Andrew? Or do you think that more legislation might be the answer? Can we learn anything from, I think, Australia launched in 2018, I believe, Canada in 2023. Is there anything we can learn from those pieces of legislation that go beyond what the UK is doing?
There are arguments for and against fines in that you don't want to drive this underground. You want businesses to be able and to want to report. You need this out in the open, as the likes of Tony's Chocolate. That's what they're doing. They put their reports out to talk about what they've found. And globally, as you've said, the legislation that's come out from Norway, from Germany, from the EU, when CS3D comes through, is looking at 5% of global turnover fine minimum for member states. Now, that is a C-suite risk to any business. Any business is a 5% loss of turnover. So it is important that it is taken in that manner by businesses, that this is a commercial risk. But more than that, and the likes of Marshalls from many, many years ago, anybody who sees a Marshalls truck driving past will see the Modern Slavery Helpline number on the side of that. That's been in place for 20 years at least. And I only know that because that's where I started talking about ethical trading many, many years ago. Marshalls have been leading the field before legislation was there and doing it because it was the right thing to do, especially with the commodities that they were bringing into this country. So in terms of the Modern Slavery Act, as Andrew said, there will be changes to that over the next 10 years. We're pretty certain about that. There is new TIS guidance out that has been launched by the Home Office. That is very, very useful. It's available online. It's available free of charge. That takes steps on how you can manage this risk. But I think to kind of finalise that, what the EU did, or what was going to come in with double materiality in terms of CS3D and ESRS, that they've hinged a point there, which is You can have training and you can have audits and you can have all these lovely things. If it doesn't make any difference, then that's what we need to do. That's what double materiality was trying to do. It was saying, what are you doing and what actually happens as a result? Are you finding more people? Has that campaign actually worked? And that is very useful. And I think that's where we need to look.
How difficult is it to keep this high on the agenda, Madeline, in organisations? How, we've got so many other pressures and priorities. How do you keep it at the forefront?
It is a challenge. And the S out of ESG, it is a tough one that can sit behind net zero, social mobility, and always following government priorities and where they're leaning. We always look at what happens in the King's Speech as to what may happen the next year. And if modern slavery isn't mentioned, then that is a back foot position, because we want this to be talked about. But the most important thing behind that is keeping talking about it, the continued conversation, and bringing the reality to the doors of the board to understand this is something that we still need to prioritise. And that's what I've been doing for 8 years at Sodexo. And all of the collaborations that we have then strike that in other businesses who may be at a very early journey in their maturity. So you need to then educate them to understand what it is and how it is and what to do about it. So conversation, and there is more press on this now. There is more focus, but we need more, and we need to continue that conversation as we are today.
I guess it's a job not only to keep it alive internally in your own organisation, but in the hearts and minds of your suppliers as well. How do you keep them engaged?
Again, you've got different suppliers at different levels of maturity, and you have to be proportionate, and you have to understand where that supply is coming from. UK-wise, it should be simpler, it may not be, but internationally, that's something you've got to understand where that supply is coming from, how you can engage with them over a myriad of commodities, fruit and veg, cocoa. You've got to understand what is the makeup of that culture, that climate, and what they understand, and then guide them and help them develop alongside you. Give them the tools to be able to do it. That means sharing your resources, doing the training, giving workshops, giving masterclasses to help them to be able to work with the parameters of what your organisation expects. And that can be supplier forums, sustainability groups with your suppliers and clients, not just a code of conduct that you ask somebody to sign and the ticket. That's not it. That's not supporting your suppliers to do something about this.
Really interesting, Madeline. You mentioned there are a couple of areas like cocoa and agriculture that modern slavery is quite prominent in. I know, and we heard this at the CIPS Futures Conference in Australia earlier this year, that the solar panel industry is also one where it's incredibly rife. But Andrew, are there any other sectors or commodities, maybe supply chain commodities, that modern slavery is high on the, the risk is high, for example?
I put a piece out on LinkedIn a few months ago where I sort of almost in exasperation said, is there nothing that I can buy that isn't tainted by forced labor? So the short answer is actually almost every commodity, and I guarantee every business will have this. There are some that are more vulnerable than others. Sometimes that's around how a business is structured. So where you have a lot of subcontracting, you put a lot of vulnerability potentially into the equation. And then from what we see from the data, it's industries like construction, where we see a lot of problems, where logistics is taking place. But as Madeline and I have both said already, is it keeps moving. If we look back 5-10 years, we would have said, okay, it's predominantly in agri. Now we're saying it's construction, it's care sector, it's hospitality. When you look at commodities, and this transition to the sustainable economy, yes, but lithium and all those raw earth materials are all vulnerable to it. The Great British Energy Bill, we fought and worked on an amendment with others that now says, for Great British Energy, you cannot purchase goods that are tainted by forced labor. We got that same amendment into the Healthcare Act in terms of the NHS cannot purchase goods that are tainted by forced labor. And they're having to look at both medical equipment and clothing. And, for businesses, often your vulnerability could be in goods not for sale, where you don't have that same level of due diligence. So I think the bottom line is consider everything vulnerable, know where the supply chain goes, know the circumstances in which it's made, And don't think just because, okay, that commodity doesn't necessarily appear on a list somewhere that it's not vulnerable to it. What we have learned over the years is that these exploiters are hugely resourced, $500 billion profits per annum. They dance around legislation and they really don't care. They're looking at your business and going, where's the vulnerabilities? Where can I make that opportunity to make money? This is all about making money and finding vulnerabilities in which to make it.
Exactly that, because these aren't a bunch of cowboys or opportunists. This is serious organised crime, isn't it? And they are actively seeking out what the next opportunity is for them.
And I think what you can extend that to there, as a procurement person, don't look at it at just a commodity level. Look at it at supply level. Look at it about that business, because it's simply having a broad brush approach in terms of risk assessment on commodities. It doesn't get down to what the origin of that product is, what the manufacturer is, the tiers that are expected now through the Procurement Act and other elements of legislation. You have to look down levels, and that's what's required on the modern slavery assessment tool that the government have in place. You have to look past, well, I know that oranges or chocolate are at risk. Look further into that. Look at where it's coming from. In parliamentary evidence session that was about China and yogurt and the Xinjiang region, oranges were mentioned because of bans that have been put in place, like the Forced Labour Directive around the EU, like the bans that they have around the US. There are now channels that say it has to go to another country because some countries aren't allowing that in, and oranges are produced en masse within China. So if it says non-EU on your oranges, it's probably coming from China, because they can't send it anywhere else. So look at these things at this most singular level that you can and see how you can prevent that from coming into your supply chains.
Thanks both. Amazing insights there. If you were to leave one piece of advice with our listeners, what would that be? Andrew?
It would be look for it, know you're going to find it, and don't be afraid to report that you have found it.
Madeline?
Ask people within your procurement team, reach out and say, is there anybody who's got a passion about this, an interest in modern slavery and human rights due diligence, and support that person then to develop a strategy to create something about modern slavery within your organisation. And that's what happened when I arrived at Sodexo and I took that on. And you find that person and they will drive it and they will be passionate about doing something about it. And that is within all procurement teams, all supply management teams across the UK. There will be a person who wants to do this.
Great stuff. Thanks ever so much for joining us. So that's it for this episode of Futures. Thanks to Andrew and Madeline. Check out the link in this episode's description to head to the CIPS Foundation webpage, where you can find out more about the projects we support, bursaries. You can download our new impact report, where you can see each project's progress to date, as well as links through to our playlist. You can see some great videos of all the projects that we're supporting this year.
If you're a regular listener to the podcast, please do share it with your colleagues, teams and network. This podcast has been brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. For more information on CIPS, head over to cips.org, where you can find out more about our upcoming events and all the excellent training opportunities on offer. For now though, that's it from us. Tune in again soon for the next episode.